Good afternoon. In this video, I'm going to address a work here by Henry Morris on the Genesis account. And of course, Henry Morris is a creationist, a young Earth creationist, and his view of the gap theory shows one of the problems in discussing this view, because there's misperceptions put out there what the gap view is. He points out here on page 46 that the gap theory was first revived in the early 19th century by the Scottish theologian Thomas Chambers. Notice the word revived. It was earlier than this. He brought it back. He didn't start it. It has been widely popularized by the notes of the Scofield Reference Bible and has been taught in most of the Bible institutes and fundamental seminaries in the United States in the past century. Now, his view is that this gap view, because is accepting of the geological record, that this leads to an acceptance of the evolutionary theory based on the fossil record, which is totally false. Because the problem with the fossil record doesn't support evolution at all. There's no transitional being or fossils that have been found that show any type of evolution. So his assumption there that if you accept the geological age system, you're going to accept the fossil record is ludicrous. The issue is the fossils are everywhere, showing a cataclysm, not a uniformitism, and that's the issue with evolution. And also the fact that the gap people, we believe the creation is exactly what it says: the 6 literal days, and that Adam was created directly by the hand of God. So there's no evolution in the gap. Now he goes on here, he says, the gap theory is not only impossible scientifically, but also destructive theologically. Now this is where we get some problems here. He says, if that world existed, talking about 2 Peter 3:6, in reference to a world before the creation of the recreation of this present earth, if that world existed prior to the supposed pre-Adamic cataclysm, then it existed before the sin of Satan, which brought on the cataclysm. No, it didn't. No, it didn't. See the assumption there? That somehow he's pointing out there would be death before sin entered into the world through Satan. And in fact, what we'd say is that any signs of destruction would be because of the fall of Satan, not prior to the fall of Satan. So that's a false assumption on his part. That is, suffering and death existed for a billion years before the sin of Satan. I haven't heard anybody say that. I haven't seen anyone say that. And the subsequent sin of Adam. Notice now, first comes the sin of Satan, then comes the subsequent sin of Adam. And when you get to the account in Genesis 3, he never explains where this fall happens and the time element involved. He never explains it. He just goes on as if somehow he doesn't have to explain the fall and where this creature where Satan came from. He acknowledges that there was a sin that came in before the sin of Adam, and that's the only thing you have to make sense of. Make sense of that fact that there was a sin in the universe before Adam, and that's where we get where the serpent shows up. And so he doesn't have to point out anything about the consequences of this sin, and the fact that this sin was supposedly the sin. Sin brings in death, and yet this sin, Satan's sin, came first. It didn't bring any death in. The fact is that after that, when man fell, then death came into the world, and he says here the first human sin, and that's the key issue. There was a sin before Adam's sin, and that's Lucifer's sin, and he fell sometime before Adam did, and that has to be brought in to explain that theological point. He doesn't explain it. He doesn't show anything. He doesn't try to explain where this happened, when it happened. He just says that it happened, and he doesn't explain what the ramifications would be in that situation. So here you have a case where you have a proponent of the young Earth creationist making false assumptions about the gap view, and saying that it lines up with the evolutionary viewpoint, which it does not. And old Earth doesn't have anything to do with evolution, because you still have an immediate creation going on, immediate destruction, which goes against evolution. You also have the issue of the fall of Lucifer, and he just simply ignores placing that anywhere in the Genesis account. He leaves that out, and therefore you have a problem with that. He makes the assumption that their death and destruction would occur before the sin of Satan, and no, nothing is said about that. Nothing is said about any type of destruction occurring before, any death occurring before the sin of Satan. That is put in there as a red herring. That is put in there to try to undermine a view that essentially he doesn't want to deal with. The young earthers don't want to deal with the fact there has to be a gap somewhere in their narrative, in their time period. Lucifer's sin has to be placed in the Genesis account, Genesis before Genesis 3 somewhere, and that's what these guys don't want to do. They're very myopic. They're focused on the evolutionary issue, and the evolutionary issue is really not a problem. The reason evolution is taking over the schools is not because of any scientific evidence supporting evolution. The fossils do not support evolution, but the fact is that it's a philosophy, and because they've left the reality of the King James Bible, now you've got the vacuum that's created, and so man is basically just turning to to fables. So again, the issue of the gap is that what has to be explained in the account, the Genesis 1, first chapter 1 and 2, before you get to chapter 3, you've got to explain the serpent shows up. There was a sin before Adam's. Morris accepts that. Morris believes that. So those who attack the gap and say, well, you can't have Adam or sin, death came in by Adam into the world. Morris accepts the reality that there was a sin before Adam, and that sin did not result in the death of the world, death of mankind. Adam's sin resulted in the death of mankind, and that's the issue with that. But Lucifer's fall would have resulted in a total cataclysmic effect on the world, and therefore God would have had to throw off the angelic realm that was with him and throw him out. We also note that in Matthew 25:41, it states that the lake of fire was created for Satan and his angels, not for man. So there's a lake of fire that's created for Satan, and that creation is not mentioned in Genesis 1, Genesis 3 through the first chapter of Genesis. So again, these are the problems with those who want to reject the gap viewpoint in the Genesis gap. And the reality is that there has to be an acknowledgement that the sin of Satan came first, and that has to be placed somewhere before Genesis 3. And the most likely place is between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. But if those who are going to argue against the gap, they need to argue for a position that they've got to place it before Genesis 3 with the serpent, and they've got to allow some time, because we know from the account of Ezekiel 28 there was a trafficking going on to convince 1/3 of the angels to fall. So again, there are going to be many misconceptions of what the gap teaches, and the reality is this is really about the fall of Lucifer, not geological ages. And whether geological ages line up with that issue is irrelevant. What the young earthers are upset about the gap people is that we're not too concerned about evolution, and so we don't get on that bandwagon and try to make a big apologetics against evolution, because evolution is absurd. It's absurd, and to believe in evolution, you got to be a nut, because you got to believe something came out of nothing. So it's really, all the science, falsely so-called, you don't need to take it seriously. We don't need to take it seriously in the vast apologetic that's risen around trying to refute evolution on a scientific basis is really kind of nonsensical. because you're trying to disprove something that can't exist. It can't exist because you go back to the beginning. Something cannot come from nothing. So again, the issue of the gap is dealing with a Bible issue, not a secular evolution issue, and that's why the gap view from Genesis 1:1, 1, 2 is trying to deal with the issue of Genesis 3 and the serpent, and dealing with Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14, and where those verses go in the timeline of the scriptures. And the fact is that the gap is not supportive anyway of evolution, but is supportive of the idea of like what the Bible truly teaches about the first sin that came in the universe. It wasn't Adam's, it was Satan's. Amen. Thank you.